Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting of the new year on January 25th. Happy to see everybody. Thank you, Catherine, posted the agenda in the chat for us for easy access. We have, I feel like we're starting anew. We've had some really good kind of a time away to allow the cap to sink in, to allow the legislature has gone back into session. The council recommendations on funding has gone to the legislature, and personally for VEM, we're back into the COVID mix. Supporting the health department and the healthcare system with the COVID surge. The good news is that it looks like we're on the downhill side of case growth, which is really good. And we're hoping that that is a trend that continues. And our primary focus at AEM is to try and bring resources to bear to help the healthcare systems. That's taken up a lot of our time, hopefully only for the next few weeks, and we can get to a point where the resource needs aren't as heavy and we can demobilize at some point. Catherine, what have you been doing?
I just had a giant background noise when you said Catherine, and then I didn't hear the last part.
What you been up to?
Not so much. Yeah, this and that. Same as everybody else.
You did note at the council the other day that that this group gets the gold star.
Really?
And I wasn't involved in that, so I want.
Well, I shouldn't really. We should let Chris Cochran talk about it because he did a lot of that behind the scenes stuff.
I just suggested it was a good idea to a few key legislators, and they agreed. And Catherine and Chris Campany really sealed the deal. So I guess what we're talking about here is one of the cap actions in our section was to not require people to sit in those rooms all by themselves when you had a remote meeting. It made a lot of sense. It's improved the quality of my life already.
Mine too.
Yeah, it's a temporary change, but yeah, meetings can be purely virtual now without having to have somebody sit in the room. And that was the first official cap action that the legislature acted upon and the governor signed, and it's a law now. So enjoy your remote meetings from home.
You're not home though.
Well, that's a long story.
But when my finance committee met last night, I did not need to be the only person in our big old historic building that has lots of ghost noises. Yeah. So that worked out really well, and I was very happy. So thank you all for putting it in our cap recommendations, and we get the gold star for the first action that's been acted on.
So I'll just go over the agenda real quick, and then we can get into the discussion items. So it's posted on the calendar, part of the climate change, State of Vermont climate change website. Just do a quick overview of the agenda. The minutes are posted in there. Just want to pause for a second in case anybody has any changes to those minutes to our December meeting. Okay, and then we'll talk through 2022 work tasks, a couple of things on there, talk about what those should look like, as well as open it up for some discussion about any other work tasks that this subcommittee should be focusing on. Talk about subcommittee composition and meeting schedule throughout the year. Then we'll be talking with Jane, as well as any other subcommittee members that have legislative updates. Take some public comment, and then adjourn no later than 1:55. Any questions about the agenda or additions to the agenda?
I'll just note that we'll shuffle the order a little bit because Jane wants to be present for the Municipal Vulnerability Index conversation, and so we'll she has a very small window she can join us, and so we'll schedule that part of it when she's here.
What was her time frame that she was going to be joining us?
I think 12:20.
Okay.
Yeah, she has about 12:20 until 1. So if we can squeeze in municipal vulnerability index and legislative update in that time frame, if not, I have notes on the legislative update that I can provide.
Okay.
Great. And then for those of you who haven't joined us in a while or might be joining us the first time, we keep a pretty informal process. So even if you're not an official subcommittee member, please feel free to raise your hand or jump into conversation rather than waiting for public comment period.
All right, should we move right into 2022 work tasks? So there's a couple of items that we are required to cover by statute. One is developing the municipal vulnerability index, which we did have start to have some discussions on last year. Tabled it until so we could focus on the cap, but now we'll get back into that piece. And then also the Global Warming Solutions Act requires that we put together recommended tools for municipalities looking to increase their climate resilience. So we'll talk about what that looks like. But so those are kind of the minimum items that need to happen. When the Climate Council was meeting the other day, there was some initial discussion about work planning and doing some goal setting as a council. I had to step out for that, Marianne and Catherine, so I don't know if there was any discussion that was pertinent to rural resilience that you had updates on.
I had to step out for a portion of it too. So I can't remember anything specific other than that there is funding in the budget that is available for the Municipal Vulnerability Index for some consultant assistance. But beyond that, I kind of missed the rest of it.
Yeah, I don't think you all missed too much. There wasn't anything specific to rural resilience's work. I think there was an outline, and I can post it in the chat because the last slide of the presentation has a good bulleted list of the council's deliverables over the next couple of months, and that will sort of determine how often the council meets. There wasn't enough time at the meeting to finalize that, so I think Jane and I will be working with the steering committee to come up with a proposal for the council. So it was more broadly about council work tasks, and Catherine's correct that there is in the existing budget for the Global Warming Solutions Act money that ANR would like to set aside for the Municipal Vulnerability Index, as well as building out the other required component of deliverables for this year, which is the measuring and assessing progress tool. So I think, once Jane joins, we can dive in a bit more into the Municipal Vulnerability Index. And then, as Erica was saying, the other task for rural resilience is thinking about a climate toolkit, which is identified sort of broadly in 2 different places under the Rural Resiliences section of the Global Warming Solutions Act. We don't have funding set aside for that, but that's going to be something that I'll be supporting heavily. So we can talk a bit more about what that looks like and how to start framing up that project.
So we do have a couple of minutes to talk about that. I don't know if we want to dive into it in detail now, or if we want to save that for our future agenda. I think the idea
we have the time, so I think we can talk about it. And I think Catherine Catherine Erica, as we talked about the other day, I think identifying for the subcommittee how you all are thinking this work would progress over the next couple of months with potentially a small group, or if the subcommittee wants to do it together, but what that would look like, so we sort of have an idea and folks can express interest in whether or not they'd like to be more intimately involved with these particular projects would be a good thing to identify today too.
And I think it would be good. So we can start with the toolkit because we want to hold off on the vulnerability index conversation until Jane can join us. And if it would be helpful, I could share my screen to show you the outline of what we thought we would do the last time we talked about this. And that can at least remind us what we thought we were going to do, and we can reflect on that based on what we know now. So this is what we had in our work plan the last time we talked about doing a toolkit and coming up with something for municipalities to use to do their own self-assessment and figure out what tools they can use to improve their own resiliency. We certainly didn't meet our original timeframe of fall of 2021, but we did recognize through our process and conversations with key counselors and other resource folks that there is a lot, as we suspected, there's a lot of work already done. And so perhaps the work of this subcommittee and others from the council or other subcommittees that want to work on this will instead be working with Marion to identify the tools that are already out there and the best way to make them available to our municipalities, and then seeing if there's any gaps. I'm curious what people think about that approach. Joe, you're muted.
I said that sounds like a good approach to me. That was sort of my impression too, that I've heard of other tools that are out there, so it makes sense to kind of inventory and see what's available. Maybe just share that information. I mean, I think about like the ANR's Flood Ready site as an example, which I know that's like one threat, flooding, but it's kind of the big one for us. It seems like that's a good example of a tool that municipalities could use.
I think it'll be important for us to kind of come to an agreement on what we're trying to communicate with this. So, we could gather probably a whole bunch of tools and resources that towns could use, but we may want to just kind of set what the direction is like, and I think we can kind of frame out. Is it a hazard by hazard toolkit? Is it, are there some overarching themes we want to communicate in terms of increasing rural resilience? So I think those are things that we want to just be able to talk through, and then that will translate in how the toolkit is portrayed, online, and how towns can potentially use it.
We've talked many times about the lack of municipal capacity, and creating a huge toolkit can really be very overwhelming for municipalities and just create a lot of stress. So to whatever extent we can connect individual tools with technical assistance providers or actual live human beings that can help navigate those tools and are available to help municipalities navigate those tools, I think it's pretty important. I also think we should, as Erica, you just described, really curate that list and be as clear as we can about what the tool does and how it's helpful, so the towns don't have to spend a lot of time, searching down loose dead ends if that's not what they're after. So I think the organizational system of the toolkit is really important as well.
Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. We did, just in terms of helping towns navigate all of this, we did send a request into the appropriations committees asking to expand our ARPA program to anything that might come out of the climate action plan in terms of work items, and H518 being one of them, the fuel switching legislation, and also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I think we've worked really well with the regional commissions on the ARPA front, and we're hoping that the legislature sees the utility of that going forward, to your point just now.
Thanks, Karen. That's good information to have. And I think all of these, Anne gave a thumbs up when Jens was talking about the toolkit needing to be accessible. So definitely there's some consensus on that, and the need to have an actual person associated with the online tools as well. And I'll say, whoever brought up the Flood Ready, or Joe, you brought up Flood Ready. That was my first thought when you mentioned that website. Is I find it hard to navigate, because it's just so overwhelming with the amount of information on there. And I'm doing this as a profession, so I can't imagine trying to do it as a select board member when you're finding time in between your dog complaints and your budgeting.
Your job, your full-time job,
Yes.
usually.
Ben,
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. I agree that less is going to be more. Flooding is the #1 hazard that I think we need to focus on, and that communities are focused on according to their local hazard mitigation plans. I think there's an opportunity to roll this into our upcoming state hazard mitigation plan. I think our hazard mitigation team can be on point for putting this together. The bullet points to me are pretty small in number and straightforward. Flood ready is an access point. We've been relying on it for a long time. It's where we send communities to find out what they need to do next and what their status is with respect to a lot of their readiness elements. We now have the Flood Resilient Community Fund. We now have a line item for a source of non-federal match for taking advantage of hazard mitigation programs. Those are really important things for communities to know. And then we have now a contract where we're using FEMA management costs to provide technical assistance to communities and RPCs on their behalf to develop benefit cost analyses for prospective hazard mitigation projects. So that list of things that I just said makes a very helpful one-pager for a community official, I think.
great. I think lots of good thoughts everyone's sharing on this. Are there people who would like to volunteer to work directly with Marion as part of a smaller subgroup over the next few months? Or I don't know what your time frame is that you're thinking, Marion. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we don't have there's not a really tight timeline on this. So I think we do have the time to explore those points that folks have been so correctly bringing up about ensuring that we're not oversharing information, but that it's useful information and we're able to connect communities to appropriate technical assistance beyond just referencing a tool. So again, I think we have the time to do this. I think getting it kicked off, especially with, I think a smaller group makes sense, unless everybody on the subcommittee volunteers, in which case we'll just go with the whole subcommittee. But to start scoping out what this could look like and then thinking about what a build out could look like and kind of pairing that with engagement around the climate action plan, particularly the spring, would be a good, I think a good timeline to think of. So yeah, I think Catherine brought up a great point. If folks are taking a look at this and sort of the scope and thinking about toolkits that you're aware of or things that you've noted in your work with municipalities that are missing and you're interested in helping build this out as a potential tool or as a tool for a toolkit for municipalities to take advantage of, let's get a list of names and see who's interested.
Chris, was that an interest or a question?
Sorry, I don't volunteer for anything anymore. I've quit. No, but kind of on that note, I think we have good subject matter experts on this. But it'd be really terrific to have some help with this because this is actually a pretty hard thing to do well and make it accessible. And how much resources have been allocated to our work as compared to some of the other committees. So I just want to bring that up. Thank you.
I am volunteering.
Great. So I think we have Ben and Jens who have volunteered so far to work with Marion. Chris, is that another comment or just, okay.
Nope.
So I think that's a great point about resources and I appreciate that we're building on what exists. And one of the things I've been thinking about is we do have a lot of funds that have been allocated for the Municipal Vulnerability Index. And should it not cost that much, which I'm hoping it doesn't, potentially we could request, I don't know if we would get it, but we could request if we identify holes in this toolkit where we need to fill in to make it more accessible for municipalities, perhaps that's one place we could look to get some funding to help with that.
And I'll just flag too, there was a conversation in the council yesterday, and Catherine Eric can jump in if I'm missing anything, but a conversation around additional resources needed above and beyond the budget as it's stated now. And so that's one part of what the steering committee will be thinking about, is a way to essentially collect information or ideas about resources that are needed from subcommittees and begin to package that into a potential request to the legislature. So I think that would be one way to fit that in as well, in addition to what Catherine noted about the Municipal Vulnerability Index funds.
Yeah, and Catherine, I think it goes without saying that whatever tool is used, we're happy to give the data that's in our tool over to that tool, so that people aren't doing the research on electric reliability, communication reliability, and the CDC's socioeconomic risk is all in that tool. So we could just give that to whoever's building the other tool, and that would save a lot of research on those three things.
I agree. I think you joined after we noted that. We're going to talk about the vulnerability index once Jane's able to join us. And definitely, there's so much that's already been done. Some great work. And it looks like in the chat we have Ben is volunteering, Caroline and Karen and Anne are also willing to work on this, recognizing Karen's a little busy in the legislative session and Anne will be fitting it in. So we've got a great list.
Yeah, I just put the folks that I had in my list here. So if other folks are interested, or we'll, I think, continue to, and this is the thing we can talk about as we think about schedule of this subcommittee moving forward, but I'm assuming that the small group would work on this and then provide updates at the subcommittee meetings, depending on the frequency we want to meet. And so I'll email these folks to set up a time to chat, and we'll dive in a bit more into what this could start to look like.
That sounds great. And then if anybody has seen a municipal toolkit or assessment for resilience that would be helpful for municipalities, please forward them to Marion, and maybe we could put that same request out to all of our counselors too. And I know Leslie Ann had some feedback on this item and had some resources, which we may already have, but just making sure.
I think she was on the vulnerability index.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And she also had some assessment resources too from all of her national work.
I did want to throw out one idea as I was looking at the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee charge in the GWSA. So I think we're referencing item D, which you had up on the screen earlier about recommending tools for municipalities. But I'm wondering if I'm curious for folks' thoughts on this, about folding in some of the development of best practices, which is also a requirement of this subcommittee. I think we built it in as an action into the climate action plan. But I think it's a pretty quick jump from thinking about tools to examining best practices, and perhaps that's something that we think about including in this project scope as well.
Are you talking about the best practices for reducing fossil fuel use? Mm-hmm.
It would be nice to have some best practices for select boards. How do you deal with this?
I thought you meant originally best practices for each vulnerability, but that expands quite a bit, but something to think about.
That'll be a long list. Yeah, sorry. No, I'm referencing it's develop best practices specific to rural communities for reducing municipal, school district, residential fossil fuel consumption, fortifying critical transportation, electricity, community infrastructure, and creating redundant storage of local electrical systems. But yeah, you certainly bring up a good point too, that I think folks could potentially be looking for other hazards as well.
So I think Anne gave a big thumbs up on that. I would agree. I saw some other nodding heads as well, that if we can incorporate some of these best practices into this toolkit, that would be really helpful. So recognizing we only have Jane for a short time, as soon as she's able to, oh, she's connected. Okay. As soon as she's, are you connected, Jane? Thumbs up? Okay, great. So Thank you, Marion, for taking the lead to work with that small group on the toolkit and potentially best practices as well. And then we will now shift gears a little bit to talk about the Municipal Vulnerability Index. So as Mike noted, and Erica also noted earlier, we did a lot of work on this early in our composition once we first started. And we got to a point where we had talked about it, actually quite a bit of the work that had been done. And then we had to put it all on hold to focus on the climate action plan pieces. But as a reminder about where we left things, Green Mountain Power have been working with the Department of Public Service. I'm going to give my best overview, and then Mike and Ann can add in anything that I missed. Had done this amazing project statewide where they were working on a vulnerability analysis statewide that was focused really on electrical vulnerability, but they were kind enough, GMP was kind enough to work to expand that vulnerability index to look at not only electrical resilience, but also, as Mike noted, the CDC indicators for social vulnerability and some other key indicators. And we took some time at a meeting to review that work. And then immediately after that, ended up having to put everything aside. So Mike, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that effort.
I think you hit it pretty well. We were looking to see where best to put resiliency zones, which is why we started with it. But it certainly is something that, towns, it would give them an idea of how they are in comparison, what their vulnerability is in comparison to other areas. The other piece, we did add communication. I think that was Ann's recommendation. But those are the three things that are in there right now. And that's why I said the data has all been collected for that, at least the source data and where it came from. So we could easily turn those over to whatever tool we use so that people aren't having to start from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Ann would add anything to that.
That sounds good. I mean, GMP went and developed it for their own purpose. And I think, while you were doing your own service territory, expanded it to the other distribution utilities. So statewide, the other distribution utilities didn't have an active role in that. I think they communicated some of their reliability stats to you, Mike, but if we were going to kind of build on that, we'd want to bring, I think, those voices into that as well. And I noted the other factors that Jane just put into the chat that I think there are some of those things that would need to be layered on top. And I think we had the discussion about, if there's an environmental justice type of index that's developed coming out of S148, some other existing tools. I think that was our struggle, is there's existing tools, there's some new pieces. Where do we get the ability to merge all these things together? Can ADS help with that? We need sort of the mapping capability and the people with the access to the map layers, and to understand what is not developed yet to layer on top of that. But I think ideally we would build upon what GMP did, because that's in active use right now for a purpose. So it'd be great to kind of build upon that as opposed to scrapping that.
And so it's helpful just to put it in context that in terms of the next work of the council, there are funds set aside to develop a request for proposals, to bring on some consultant assistance to do just what you and Ann and Mike were talking about, to take what's been done and put it in the context of the Climate Council and the work that we need to do according to statute. And it's definitely a challenge when you do any of these things to cover, you want to come up with a list of 100 different measures, but the more you add, the less it becomes meaningful. And so it's definitely a challenge to balance all of that out. Jens, did you want to add anything?
Catherine, I did hear what you just said, but I do think that municipal vulnerability is a lot more than just the hazards piece, and that we need to think in a much bigger sense. just sprawling development, for example, is a huge threat that can undermine rural resilience and adaptation in particular. And so I think the GMP work is a great a great start and a huge piece of what we need to cover. But I think the landscape of vulnerability is much bigger than that. And so things, metrics like, is there a robust planning, town plan? Is there a planning system? Are there regulations in place to limit development in some parts of town? All of those are parts of municipal vulnerability that are outside of the hazard piece, while sometimes related. And I just want to make sure we really truly think big about vulnerability here.
I think Jane just put, there's some minimum data points that we need to incorporate that are in statute, but this is all part of this, which is, and this is kind of where we got hung up the last time, which is identify what needs to be measured is a measure of vulnerability in the context of climate change. And so, we don't have to come up with the answer today, but that's part of this piece that, bringing on some contract support will help us bring some subject matter experts to advise on what equals vulnerability in the case of climate change for municipalities in Vermont.
I agree with everything that's been said as far as like all the stuff that needs to get wrapped into this. And I think it's great we have a start with the electrical side, the communication side maybe. But two things I have been on my mind about this is taking a step back and asking, what is it going to be used for? What's its purpose? Which I don't think is actually defined in the legislation. It just says do this. And so, which to me means we can determine what its purpose should be. I think there's some logical things, like you want to track progress and related to that is we should really be thinking about putting things or the metrics in this measure that are sensitive to the kinds of investments that we would make, right? So, if we're going to spend money improving the electrical grid, we should see, resulting in improvement in the vulnerability index as a result of that, or transportation or anything else. So that's just some things to think about as we design this. But first and foremost, it's like, why? What is this thing going to be used for? And then from there, we can sort of, launch it, I think.
In my head, that's what it's for, Joe, is it's identifying the areas that need attention first and using some possible, whether it's ARPA funds or infrastructure funds or whatever there is to address those issues. That's what I hope it's for.
Track.
Yeah.
Right.
We had put that, I just put it in the chat. That was one of our key strategies when we did our first work plan about this index, is to figure out what the heck it's used for.
Go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say that it was really great that Joe just brought up the measuring and tracking progress. And of course, thinking about the ultimate purpose and goal of this is sort of left to the discretion of the group that works to put this forward. But that is the other component of the statute that we are planning to use our remaining technical analysis funds for this fiscal year 22. So over the course of the next few months, and that is that we're required to have up and standing a measuring and tracking progress tool by 2024. And that tool is beyond and larger than just emissions reductions. It speaks to resilience metrics as well as wildlife, biodiversity. And so we had hoped actually through the contract we had with Cadmus and EFG that we would actually build that tool for the climate action plan. And what we were actually able to do is just to get to the framework and the purpose of that tool over the course of the last 6 months. It took a small group of meeting and understanding what was out there to even just to put the framework in place. And now we're working with them to put together the detailed scope as well as the cost estimate for that. So just building off of that, we have roughly $400,000 to $450,000 left in our technical analysis budget for right now, and have been thinking about roughly, not knowing what either will cost, 50% going to either one of these tools. And so I could see, a group, and I have been thinking that while this is housed in rural resilience, that you would want to invite in to a task group someone who represented the work of just transitions and someone who represented the work of science and data, in order to have a cohesive task group that was working through the development of the purpose and goals in order to ultimately put out an RFP for support that would be needed to build the municipal vulnerability index. And our hope and expectation would be that over the course of the next few months that we would be able to get to the point of putting out an RFP for that. So it feels like there's been so much great work done, but I really appreciated what Joe just mentioned about stepping back and really thinking about the long-term purpose and goal of how this tool would be used, and then ultimately how it would be coordinated and also feeding into the measuring and tracking progress tool that the state would also be housing in A&R. So there'd be nice complementary paths right now.
Jane, are you asking for any more money from the legislature for, going forward to support,
Yeah.
these ongoing initiatives?
Yeah, so it's all tied up a little bit in the climate office budget now, and so it's a little complicated. So as I think I've shared with all the subcommittee members and council and staff who've been supporting this process, the governor put forward not only ARPA budget, but also in the general fund budget, sustained budget of an increase of $650,000 for A&R. And that's above and beyond our base funding that we already get for Marion and I, as well as a third position that we've never hired, which is a legal service position that's supposed to support, which we never felt like was fully needed through the development of the climate action plan, because it was really to support rulemaking efforts.
Mm-hmm.
So now the climate office has a base funding for 8 positions, 4 of which are existing and 4 of which are new. And then there's what we expect on top of that, roughly $200,000 to $300,000 of base funding for technical analyses. And then we also got one-time funding of roughly $100,000 also for next year. So we have this $450,000 left in this year's budget, and we expect to have about, it's all rough right now, $300,000 to $350,000 of increased funds for technical analysis for fiscal year 23, knowing that all of these tools will need support ongoing, as well as there's other technical analysis needs that were highlighted in the climate action plan that will need to be prioritized.
Thank you.
Jane, did you say 600 million or 6 million?
Oh, 600,000.
Okay.
6 million or 600
Whoa.
million. Both
Okay,
sound great.
thank you.
Yeah, 650,000.
So Jane, I think what I'm hearing you saying that it would be the best next step for us would be to identify some folks from the subcommittee who would like to work on a subgroup that would be cross-committee subgroup on not only municipal vulnerability, but also tracking. That's not the word. It's
Measuring.
yeah.
Measuring.
Thank you. Measuring progress. And that would be a group that would inform, the RFP process and contract support process. Is that what I'm hearing? I know that
we.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, we've been sort of in a pause on the measuring and tracking progress, waiting for this detailed scope of work. It keeps stalling because of having UVM come on board with it also as a subcontractor now. But there was a task group who was working on that, that was comprised of all science and data. And we know that that's why I dropped in here that the scope and stakeholder component for actually this next phase would need to be much bigger and have more people involved. And so I could imagine, I'm not sure if they're the same group of people, but it does feel like at some point we're certainly going to want someone thinking about resilience metrics and adaptation on the measuring and progress tool group also, and they'll have to be coordinated at some point. So I don't think we should wait on that, but know that it will have to be a coordinated effort also, and that we could start to meet on the municipal vulnerability index separately.
Oh, okay, so a small subgroup for MVI, but having some other committee representation on that subgroup. Okay, from like just transitions and science and data. I know Dr. Tiffany Drew had indicated some interest there.
And Jay Schaefer did as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. They would both be excellent.
Any other volunteers for folks that would be interested in digging in a little bit more on the municipal vulnerability index work?
I am.
Joe?
Yep.
And I'm happy to as well, at least initially.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, and obviously any data request or anything like that for the data we've already collected, I can help, or I can get Sarah that built it for us to help there too.
And Anne, you can speak a lot to that tool as well, right? Which will be wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
I was able to
for your benefit.
I was able to find most of the stuff that Sarah did for the last statewide go around, but I couldn't find the map result. So that would be awesome, Mike, if you could dig out.
I'll look for it.
Awesome.
Would be a really great group of people. Seems like the right people around the table, and I know Marion and I will both be involved, so we'll have our support.
Awesome.
And I see Ben volunteered Stephanie, so that's great since she's not here.
It's dangerous when he attends these meetings on his own. He uses to have like team members to text him. Be quiet.
And Jens, I know maybe not necessarily being on the team if you don't have capacity, but I know you've had some ideas. There was the email that you drafted a while ago, and it'd be great if at the very least for the right touch points to be thinking about some of this with you.
I have that email. I saved a whole bunch of stuff on my server from when we talked about this last time, and I'll just lump it all together and email to you, Jane and Marion, including Jens' email and some other stuff from other community members. And I think it's important to know that, this is a requirement of our subcommittee in the act. So even if you're not part of this small working group, this is going to be on our agenda every month, and there's going to be huge opportunities for feedback and information sharing.
Great. Any other discussion that we want to have on MVI? We don't have, those are the two primary items, and that's a good amount. I mean, in comparison to what we did last year, it's smaller, but it's still a good amount because last year was out of control. Are there any other work tasks that folks on the subcommittee feel like we need to look at, assess, or even explore a little bit further?
Well, I'll just share, and maybe Chris Cochran would want, I'm not sure now if this is rural resilience or cross-sector mitigation, but the idea of, the connection between smart growth and vehicle miles travel, what that relationship is. So, I've been working with Chris and Bronwyn, and, we have a scope of work, and we put in a proposal to the Agency of Transportation's research programs. It's a competitive funding mechanism, and so we wrote a problem statement, and we're looking for money to do that. And so if it gets selected, it'll start, in a few months or so. If that doesn't happen, we'll figure out some other way to kind of move that forward. But yeah, I guess that's not rural resilience, but it's just FYI.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of overlap across the board anyway. So
Right. But that's not an ask really of Jane's budget. She might be gone already.
More of a status update.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add, I mean, I do think it'd be good. I know she's carrying about, I want to say $10,000 or $20,000 for this work. So if we do need matching for a subsequent component of the study, it's something that I hope we can look to her to help.
Any other?
I missed it for a
Go
second
ahead.
there. Or I didn't hear for 1 second. Do you mean us for match? Just so I know. I wasn't clear.
Yeah, well, I think I think I told Billy and Maggie. You know, VTrans has stepped up to the plate to find a funding source for the VMT study. I think there will be a subsequent component of it. And I know you were carrying some money for VMT study in your budget. If you could hold on to that, because I think we'll need it for future. We could potentially need it for a future match.
Yeah, I think I've shared this with you, but yes, we've been carrying it. We were also carrying funding funds in our current budget for the carbon forecasting we were planning to do. And Julie, we should circle up, because this is what I keep saying. Julie keeps telling me everything's off the record, off the books now, except for these 2 statutory requirements. And I think it's because of the anxiety around the pressure for the life, like everything feels like a statutory requirement, like the life cycle analysis, there's so much pressure. And so I guess the only 2 items I was carrying my budget though was the VMT study, the match, and then 2, the carbon forecasting. I just put the kibosh on the carbon forecasting yesterday with Harvard. And so that's like freed up for other things now. And that was a agency decision on that. It didn't make a lot of sense right now for us to, amongst all the priorities, to continue with that one. But the transportation needs, it would be really good to speak about that, just because of all the other, transportation study analysis needed to make up for TCIP. There's just a lot of competing interest and pressure. And so I think we should have that conversation, and maybe it would make sense, Chris, to invite you or Joe for Andrea to represent it, as she's participating in that task group that's meeting regularly now to think about the transportation space and what's most needed in that, and technical analysis needs is certainly part of that. And there's a meeting next Monday on that, I think. Anyway, I have it in the budget still. I'm unclear what the discretion of Secretary Moore will be on how to spend it, though. I just want to say that. And there's a long-winded way of saying that, so sorry.
Okay, should we move into subcommittee composition and 2022 meeting schedule?
Maybe I actually want to jump to legislative update before Jane has to leave.
Oh, yep. Thank you for that reminder.
So thank you so much. And I imagine Catherine, who testified with me, and Chris, who's been busy testifying too, will have feel free to provide any also additional updates that more specific on the work of your subcommittee. But I will say that, as I'm sure Chris and others are feeling, it's a really busy session with relation to climate action. We've been in after tomorrow morning, it will be 7 committees of the House and Senate doing overviews of the climate action plan. So just providing high-level overviews and where appropriate, inviting in co-chairs and others to join to be able to answer more specific questions on the recommendations associated with the body of work that particular committee is largely interested in. For instance, tomorrow we're going into Senate Agriculture, and we'll be joined by not only Abby Carson and Billy Coster, but also Ryan Patch to speak specifically to some of the recommendations around agriculture. So there's been a lot of interest in just getting to understand the climate action plan at a high level as we make that pitch. We speak broadly about sort of a recognition and appreciation that it's a handoff back to the legislature, which we talked about even with the council yesterday, the need for the legislature to act in a timely manner to implement some of the policy recommendations, because the resulting impact of not doing so, especially in the emissions reduction space, will be really far more consequential for Vermonters through rulemaking or regulation out of A&R. And I think nobody really wants to see that happen. So we try to make that case, as well as speak to the principles, the work that still needs to be done around designing policies, and then sort of teeing up the ongoing work of the council, the subcommittees, and A&R for the legislature to understand. There's been specific interest in many areas. The biggest one in the emissions reduction space, and what we're testifying on at 1 o'clock, is the clean heat standard. It does feel like, and the recommendation from the Climate Action Plan was for the legislature to act this session on a clean heat standard. And so the House Energy and Transportation Committee is taking the lead on putting that bill out. I know Senate Natural Resources is taking the lead on a weatherization bill as well, which is complementary to the clean heat standard. So hopefully we'll see robust legislation in both of those areas. There's the Transportation Innovation Act that I'm sure Joe could talk about the details on way better than me. That is really exciting. And I know AOT Michelle Boomhauer is in testifying like all day, every day, which is great. There's Act 250, which I'm sure I could give you my read on from Billy, but Chris is way more in tune to that too. Lots of changes there. There's potential changes with UVA for old forest protections that they've been taking a lot of testimony on, and then also a resulting bill from House Natural Resources, Amy Sheldon, on just a larger biodiversity bill and protection that is getting a lot of traction. So lots of exciting pieces. The only one that I think through the Climate Action Plan we've been trying to sort of redirect the legislature perhaps on is the RES. There is a lot of interest in acting on 100% RES, and the way the Climate Action Plan speaks to 100% RES is it essentially says it is needed, but not needed. Thank you for putting in the acronym in the chat, Marion, but that it's not needed till after 2030. And so that we should be, that we are sort of on track and made substantial progress in making a clean electricity sector over the last, through the 75% renewable energy standard, and that we're okay, and we should be focused on other sectors like transportation and buildings and thermal, where we have not made as much progress and need the legislature to act. But as you can imagine, and Chad, if Chad's here too, that there's a lot of lobbying and pressure for 100% RES, but we've been making the case that it is not necessary for climate action right now, that it's a little bit longer down the list for us. And Liz Miller made a really great, provided great testimony on that. And Jared Duval, I think he likened it to like a clean heat standard would be a touchdown and the 100% RES would be the extra point. But it's not like, it's not the focus right now. So anyway, lots of testimony. It's been a really great process. It's been really great to see how many counselors are in there and leading on the Climate Action Plan to get their work done. So I'll pause there. That's really all I have to say about it.
I'll just also note that there's a number of climate-related initiatives in the governor's budget. So we'll be wanting to be really focused on the money committees as they're looking at the budget. I'll just call out a couple. One is the creation of a climate office that Jane just talked about, and funding some additional positions to make that a bit more well-rounded. Another one, which is near and dear to my heart, is actually creating a special fund and doing a one-time general fund transfer into it of $10 million that will provide a matching fund source for federal hazard mitigation projects. This is a really big deal because it's a structural change that has a long-term impact on our ability to fund hazard mitigation programs and leverage federal hazard mitigation dollars. In the COVID-19 Major Disaster Declaration, as a part of that, we have $11 million of federal share money available for hazard mitigation projects. That's in addition to what'll end up being a total of $20 million of ARPA funding for hazard mitigation projects. So this $10 million general fund transfer is incredibly important for the long-term viability of a hazard mitigation program and being able to reach under-resourced communities for them to be able to build hazard mitigation projects in the state of Vermont. And then the other piece is, as I mentioned, it's another $15 million of ARPA funding for the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. And that builds on $5 million that was allocated for this fiscal year. There's a number of other ones, but I highlighted my favorites.
Those are some really great highlights. Cheryl asked in the comments whether there was a list of all of the bills related to climate that's currently in the legislature. Does anybody have a ongoing list?
That would be actually a great thing to put together. Our Deputy Secretary, Maggie Gendron, puts together all the bills that are moving in any given week and buckets them by different level of interest. And so I have every Sunday night, I get a climate and all the bills listed underneath. But I haven't tried to actually distill it into one sheet, and it probably would be a really useful thing for the Climate Council also. So I'd be happy to take that on, and then we can post it to the page, send it out to counselor subcommittees. And so I'll just say, Cheryl, maybe in the coming days, you can look on our resources page, and that will go up on that. It won't be that hard.
Jane, legislators are also very interested in knowing how all these pieces come together. It is very hard to track. So I think if you could share it with them, I know they would appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Great.
There's also, and sorry, in the governor's budget, there are funding proposed to cover topics like load management, management and storage, natural working lands, EV infrastructure and incentives around that, electric service upgrades, weatherization, and then creation of resilient community centers. I mean, a lot of the initiatives that were put into the climate action plan that have been, proposed in the governor's budget as well.
We've got about, 200 million in budget requests in the governor's budget for housing. And it's all really a lot of the policy changes that Jane mentioned about Act 250 and changes to our designation programs are to ensure that the housing gets located in compact centers. So there's been really good interest and support around that. So I do think those bills will move. Just going to flag a few. It's just a really busy year. But if you have interest maybe to this group in particular would like a $30 million investment in electric vehicle charging station grants to locate them at multifamily housing, workplace charging, and in downtowns and village centers. A $750,000 increase to the municipal planning grant program, which is huge because it's about 400 right now. A big increase to the downtown tax credit program. It's right now at 3 million. It's proposed to take it up to 5. And then there's support for one of the changes that we recommended to create a flood mitigation credit. So if buildings are at risk, we're not moving them, but how can we make an investment in them to make them more flood ready, flood safe? Those are a few things. I'd love to see that list, Maggie's list, if A&R built it, so we can do a better job tracking. And I may have perspectives to add to that just so we can all be working together. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Any other legislative thoughts? A lot going on, both directly as a result of the climate action plan and just the momentum behind the topic generally. So a lot to pay attention to, a lot of amazing opportunities and actual money to put behind the dreams in many cases. So it's a brave new world out there. So next, if there's no other legislative thoughts, going once, going twice, all right. Next on the agenda, we wanted to talk about what happens next for our subcommittee, general meeting schedule, subcommittee membership, etc. So let's take the easy one first, I think, which is the general meeting schedule. At least initially, as we're getting some of these new projects off the ground, we were thinking a once a month meeting makes sense, at least for the next few months with everything that's going on, and then we can see what happens beyond that. Does that mesh with other people's thoughts?
Sounds reasonable.
Okay. And got a thumbs up from Karen too. So we are going to work to try to find a regular meeting schedule that works with everybody's calendar. And I don't know, Marion, have you given any thought for how we might accomplish that?
No.
Okay.
I can, I mean, we could take some time to figure it out and start narrowing down mornings or afternoons, what day of the week, and then go from there to say what week of the month. But it may also make sense to just check with Eric and Catherine first as your co-chairs to find some times of the week that work for you all.
Okay, so look for a poll from us.
So yeah, I think that's probably best.
Okay. Jay, welcome back. We volunteered you for everything while you were gone.
Oh, did you talk about the municipal vulnerability index at all?
We did, and we volunteered you to be part of the small group working
Okay.
on it, along with Leslie Ann.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I would say moonlighted in some of that work a little bit. So I think I could inform where it might go and try to help out there.
Outstanding. So Jane is going to take the lead on that, and she'll be in touch about trying to get the task group together.
Okay, great, thank you.
And so right now we're just talking about meeting frequency.
Yep.
So look for a poll from us about day of the week, morning, afternoon, and week of the month, and we'll move forward from there with the goal that we will try to meet before the Climate Council. So if we have to feed anything into those meetings, we can do that. But even those meetings are a little in flux too, so we'll see. All right, so the other thing we want to talk about is subcommittee membership. Do you want to take this one, Erica, or you want me to keep going?
Sure. We recognize that this committee was put together with all of you as representatives, and it was done very, very quickly. We pulled all of our subject matter experts that we knew about and that we rely upon. You have all done amazing work, and we just wanted to pause for a moment and give you the opportunity to say if you feel that you need to, I'd like to transition out, and with no harm, no foul, and a great appreciation for your work. But also welcome any suggestions for additional folks that we might want to bring on as permanent members, or at least longer term members of the committee. So again, just pausing to see, folks are looking for a chance to bow out for now, as well as suggestions on additional representation that we should have at the table to continue on our work in 2022. And you don't necessarily have to speak up and say, okay, I'm leaving. But just let you know, you please follow up with myself or Catherine if you're feeling like you can't support this into 2022. We will make sure that everybody that's here at the table can offer up their time and as they are able to.
And we hope you all want to continue, but we really do hope you want to continue, but we wanted to provide you that opportunity to step back if you needed to. And we certainly, we think we need some help with bringing some other voices on, and it would be interesting to hear from folks now if you have any thoughts about what voices we might be looking to add to this subcommittee. And Marion, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna follow up on that and just describe a little bit the process. So if you all recall, building the subcommittee the last time around, we were pretty, I think you all were rushed in it. So we do have some time now to brainstorm, and what might be a helpful way of doing it is if you have specific people that come to mind, that's great. Or maybe it's just voices around the table that as we were having conversations around actions, perhaps there was someone who would have been great to hear from, or, you know, an economist or a specialist in this thing. We could even start to identify those and brainstorm. I want to say that Catherine and Erica at the council meeting yesterday also noted to the full council that you all would be looking to potentially expand subcommittee membership. So I think if we came up with some ideas for folks with certain expertise or from certain areas that we'd like to hear from, we could also go out to the full council to solicit some ideas. And then the way that will work is the subcommittee will come to agreement with your co-chairs on who to propose, and then it will go to the steering committee for approval, but they've always supported anything that the subcommittee has gotten behind. So that's the general process for adding folks to the subcommittee.
Karen?
Yeah, so I do think it would be helpful to maybe after town meeting, look at adding a couple of select people from around the state that are interested in the issue and would be good sounding boards. I know we have a few, but I think since the target is our municipalities, that it'd be good to have some more voices about really bolstering the issue of what's actually possible at the local level.
Just flagging Ben's note in the chat about do we need housing expertise? And so I'll keep a list of these if you all come up with names or themes or voices that we'd like to hear, and we can follow up with an email to start soliciting ideas for them. So if you have ideas, feel free to shout about and I'll keep track.
To Karen's point, maybe one larger town and one smaller town, something like that.
And I know we've got Ann Lawless, and we also have Joe Sigali. I count him as a local official because he's on the planning commission, hopefully still. So there is representation, but it'd be nice to expand it. Hope I didn't out Joe Sigali.
Yeah, I'm not really here to represent the local perspective, although, you know, sometimes it comes through. I think all of us actually probably bring a little bit of that to the table.
I'll throw out there, I think at one point in time, we were trying to see if, what's the official title? Resilient Communities Program Manager at VNRC, Kate McCarthy, but she has since moved on, and they've hired somebody else. So perhaps we'd want to reach back out to VNRC to see if that new person is interested. I think it's Katie Gallagher.
Yes. Yep.
And I think it would be interesting to see about bringing a voice on the committee that works with resilience in our vulnerable communities. We don't have a voice like that on our committee now. We have people who work in that area generally, but not in a specific focus on vulnerable communities. I don't know who that person would be or people would be, but it seems like that would be a good voice to add to our group.
Yeah, I was wondering about, is it CROW, Community Resilience Community Resilience Organization, and I know I can't remember her name now. You all know who she is. What was you know, kind of instrumental in getting that set up after Irene? Are those still out there?
I don't think they're very active or visible at this time, just a few communities.
Right.
Catherine, were you thinking of someone, I mean, the people who are in the trenches who aren't in towns are people at the weatherization assistance programs. There are 5 of those around the state. They provide services for free for the lowest income Vermonters. Would that be a thought?
Yeah, potentially that is somebody from a community action agency, and or there's groups like at UVM that worked with Dr. I'm going to say her name wrong.
O'Carney?
Yes, that worked on the resilience effort in vulnerable communities. And there's other organizations and collectives throughout the state outside of the NGO that could be a place where we could look.
You know, Catherine, you mentioned somebody that's doing resilience work in local communities, and I'm not really sure such a person exists, right? Like
I said vulnerable, in vulnerable communities.
Oh, vulnerable communities.
With a focus on those that are most vulnerable versus just a general resilience focus.
Michael, so who do you mean by that, or as an example?
So I think low income, definitely. Any of our Black and brown neighbors, any immigrant groups. Okay. Just off the top of my head, any of the groups that were identified as frontline communities in our Just Transitions work.
Yeah. So it's people that are working with those groups of people, or even better, somebody that represents, you know, is from those groups.
Yeah. Yeah. So any of the frontline, I think that's a good way of describing it, is somebody who is either in a member of the frontline community identified in our Just Transitions work, or a specific person who can represent those perspectives, or people who can represent those perspectives. And recognizing many of us are multiple hats, there could be somebody who brings in multiple perspectives.
In the guiding principles document, I'll put it in the chat on the 5th page. There's a word cloud with the frontline communities. So I'll put that in there. Folks want to take a look at that. Colorful. You won't
like,
miss
how do you recruit somebody that, you know, that meets those requirements? And like, and who is that? We're just kind of relying on our networks maybe, or if we know somebody, or is there a more intentional way that, you know, we could take maybe with Just Transitions assistance to recommend somebody? Would they be able to recommend somebody?
Yeah, I think we can look to our Just Transition Subcommittee for assistance there. We can look to individual counselors who may have contacts. We can look to some of the speakers that have come to the council who spoke on these issues. So I think we can I know I personally failed to have any good contacts like that. So I need to rely on making contacts with others who can help me make those connections. Karen, do you have your hand, or is that a legacy hand? Yeah, and Cheryl noted that Judy Down might have some ideas, and she's definitely one of the people I was thinking of when I said people have come to talk with the council. And if you don't know who Judy Dow is, she did some amazing work with the council on the land acknowledgement that we just adopted at our last meeting.
Any other folks that we should reach out to include on the committee? That was a great discussion. I think we've reached the end of our agenda. I think we are at a point where we can take some public comment, unless there's any other discussion that folks want to have. Okay, we'll open it up for some public comments. Go ahead, sir.
No one's called me sir in a while.
Well, I didn't want to butcher your last name.
Thank you for your time. I work for University of Vermont Extension, as well as Lake Champlain Sea Grant Institute. So we do research and education about the lake, right? And about the basin. And Catherine, you might remember, I spoke with you. I looked it up actually, July 6th, you know.
Is that what it was? Yeah, I do remember that.
Because RPCs were really important to us in talking as we started the project, what we're doing. And it's a very small project, but just so that you know, and I wanted to learn more about what your committee was doing. In Lake Champlain Sea Grant Institute, we have a bit of resources for environmental hazard resilience. So we're working on a small project which should culminate in a few workshops, webinars over the spring, summer, fall on municipal environmental hazard resilience. So we started out talking with people like Catherine and, you know, trying to see what the landscape is, because I loved one of Catherine's quotes was like, you know, there's so much that has already been done and so many players in this. But there's three of us working on this, one from SUNY Plattsburgh, because the Lake Champlain Basin, of course, goes into Quebec as well as New York and Vermont. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a very small curriculum for municipal officials. I'm a municipal official myself. I won by a landslide. I just want everyone to know that. I'm a library trustee, treasurer, as well as serve on the Civil Board of Authority. That's sort of when I can. So we're trying to create a short curriculum for municipal officers on environmental hazard resilience. And so one of the things that we've done, we've talked to people like Catherine, and we just completed a survey. We sent out a survey to over 1,200 municipal officials that we could identify in the basin. So, you know, 200 something towns in the basin. And we've gotten the survey results. It's about, you know, what the local level of concern is about climate change, about natural hazards. What are their needs? What things have they done? All this information. And I'd be glad to, well, I'd have to talk to my co-workers, but it is in the public realm, right? So I'd be glad to share survey results with you. But we've learned a lot, and we actually heard back from 100 towns, officials in 100 towns, and we asked a question: could we use you as a sounding board, as you know, like a focus? Can we ask you a question? So 52 of town officials actually gave us their telephone numbers and email addresses to talk to as we develop the program. But I know this is just a very small part of the big picture. The three of us together add up to 3/4 of a full-time person. But I just wanted I'm here to learn about what you're doing, which is, I mean, it's huge. It just sounds pretty spectacularly huge. But I just wanted to introduce what we're doing on a very, very small scale. And if we, you know, if you see any possibility of anything for cooperation, collaboration, you know, we're being very methodical, very cautious, and taking very small steps, because we don't want to repeat. We don't want to step on toes. We want to add to the conversation. We want to add to what municipal officials have access to. So it was really neat to learn about your toolbox and things like that. So really appreciate you listening for a few minutes as I ramble. Sorry. It must be because I missed lunch, because who knew it was 12 to 2. If there are any questions, I can answer any questions that you have. But, thanks.
Thanks, Gary. I'm glad you reconnected with the group after we talked last summer. Can't believe it was that long ago. As you probably noticed earlier in the meeting, Marion's going to be our point person for working on the toolkit. So it seems like it would be great if the two of you could connect. And I saw a lot of nodding heads from Anne as the excitement for another opportunity for municipal assistance.
Any other public comment? Okay, Jay, I need to know if we're gonna have heavy snow this weekend.
I knew I couldn't escape that question today.
Somebody else might be curious too, Jay.
Well, two answers. It's looking like it's going to hug the coast a little more, so less likely for northern Vermont. And then if we do get it, Mike, it looks pretty
Like fluffy.
Chamber of Commerce, cold and dry. Yeah.
All right, I'll be watching it closely.
I have another important question for Jay. Have you tried dilly beans yet?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've made dilly beans too. I meant to follow up with Eric on that. I know dilly beans.
Okay.
Experience dilly bean eater.
I just opened a new jar from the cellar, and I was thinking about that. Like, how could somebody have never had dilly beans?
No, they're better than pickles.
They may have sounded ignorant, but it's been probably 8 years since I made them, and I do miss them because they're not the same in the store.
Wind, Jay?
Wind, I think it's not going to bother all that much. It's pretty hard in the cold weather we've had, unless it tracks much, much closer to us, which seems less likely.
I'm watching it. Even my children were like, we're supposed to get a lot of snow, like 2 feet of snow this weekend. And I was like, I've been burned so many times this winter already. I am not buying into it. It's only Tuesday.
I got about 1.5 inches just while we were meeting. There was a squall that went through. It was pretty cool.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you in the email.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Everybody.